Abdul Abiad, welcome to Asia House. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
I want to start on China growth rates. You forecast 6.3% this year, 6.1% next year, so a slight moderation. But there are private forecasts which suggest China's growth is much lower. What's your take on the position in China?
Yeah, so it's natural for China to be slowing at this stage. As we highlight in our Asian Development Outlook, part of this is structural. It's a process of convergence. The richer you are, you tend to grow more slowly. China's population is aging, and then there are these structural shifts from industry to services and from investment to consumption. And all of those naturally tend to lead to slower growth. In addition, there's also policy tightening taking place in China, basically to reduce financial risks. Whether 6.3 and 6.1 are attainable, we definitely feel so. First of all, the signs are not of a sharp slowdown right now. There's a lot of noise in the data because of trade tensions with the U.S. But our sense is that this is definitely doable. Plus, the Chinese authorities also have the policy space to respond should there be signs that it's weakening, that growth is moderating faster than they expect.
You cite the US-China trade tensions, and in fact in your report you highlight that as one of the major risks for developing Asia. How damaging could an escalation in US-China trade tensions be for the rest of the region?
Right. In our report last year, actually, we had a detailed analysis of what impact the trade conflict would have, not just on China and the US, but also on other countries in developing Asia and on the rest of the world. And China is actually the country that would be hardest hit by an escalation in the trade tensions. Our estimates are that should trade tensions escalate, and by the escalation scenario we look at is where all bilateral trade between the US and the People's Republic of China are subject to tariffs of 25%. And our estimates are that that would shave 1% of China's GDP relative to a no-conflict scenario. So it would be a substantial headwind for Chinese growth.
And also for the rest of the region because of the trade links between China and developing Asia.
Yes, so what's interesting in what we found was that our analysis actually takes into account not just direct effects of these tariffs, but also indirect effects via all these production linkages. Yes. So it's true that much of Asia supplies, let's say, intermediate inputs to China. And what we found when we quantified this, because a lot of people worry about it, including many Asian policymakers, when we actually quantified how big that effect was, it was actually pretty small. So the effects obviously it varied across countries. Some countries are more tightly linked with the People's Republic of China than others. But our estimates are actually that is again quantitatively small. In addition, there is the potential for much of developing Asia to benefit from trade redirection and production redirection.
One interesting fact in what is a very comprehensive and thorough report is the number that China's investment, greenfield investments in developing Asia have something like tripled over the last 12 months. Is that in response to the trade tensions, and how does that have impact growth in developing Asia?
Right. This process of China investing elsewhere, in part because costs of production have been rising as a reflection of higher wages and higher growth there. That's been a process that's been ongoing for a while already. I think what has happened is that the trade tensions have escalated that process, have accelerated that process, and so we attribute. I would say at least part of that big jump is attributable to the fact that you have firms now thinking, well, it's not clear that these trade tensions are going away anytime soon, or that there will be a de-escalation, and we need to be prepared. And if we were planning to do this anyway, now is as good a time as any to invest in production elsewhere.
The your forecast for developing Asia is growth of about 5.7% this year, down to 5.6%, which by Western standards is very healthy. But 5.6% is the lowest since 2001. Are we at a bit of a tipping point now for developing Asia? Are we on a downward trajectory in terms of growth?
Right. So this relates to your original question about Chinese. So as you know, China constitutes almost 60% of developing Asia.
Yes.
And so the fact that China is slowing automatically means a big chunk of developing Asia is slowing. So first, it's a natural process. It's actually healthy for China to not try to push growth even higher. There's a sustainable rate of growth for it. But if you look elsewhere, if you look at Southeast Asia, for example, we expect that growth will be maintained close to what it was last year, about 5%. And if you look at South Asia, for example, Bangladesh is growing at 8%, India is growing above 7%. And so there's a lot of healthy growth in much of developing Asia. And again, much of the slowdown you're seeing is actually a healthy adjustment in China's growth rate.
So exclude China from that 5.6, 5.7%, and you have a sort of healthier outlook for the rest of Asia.
Yes, that's true. So you would see that. It's also true, though, that developing Asia is not immune to the global slowdown. So you are seeing the major advanced economies, for example, slowing. So the U.S., Europe, and Japan. Our forecast is that growth in these major advanced economies will slow. And Asia, much of Asia is open, sells to the rest of the world, and with that slowdown, there's going to be weaker external demand.
Because you have cited that as one of the risks, that there's a greater slowdown in Western economies. But you also mentioned the potential for a disorderly Brexit. What sort of impact is that having?
Right. So one of the things we looked at in the report was what kind of impact Brexit might have on developing Asia. We'd actually looked at this a couple of years ago already, right after the referendum, and at that time we assessed that the impact on developing Asia was likely to be small. Now that 2 years on, we did a bit more careful analysis of it, in particular looking at the illustrative example of Sri Lanka, where so Sri Lanka is interesting because it's one of the countries in the region which has pretty strong trade links with the UK. I think the UK is its third largest trading partner.
Yeah. And
also it benefits from preferential arrangements because the UK is part of the EU right now, and so it's called GSP+.
Yeah.
And so that would be put at risk should the US leave. And so even for Sri Lanka, we find that quantitatively, the impact on the economy as a whole is pretty small. There are sectors such as textiles and garments that would be hard hit, so we expect Sri Lanka's textile and garments sector, for example, to see a decline of about 8% in terms of their exports to the UK should their tariff-free arrangements end. But again, sort of overall, as economy-wide, it's not that big an impact. And so our reading is that for the rest of developing Asia, the impact is likely to be small. Now, obviously, the big question is whether if a disorderly Brexit then leads to a sharper than expected slowdown in Europe and elsewhere, and there are confidence effects, that's much harder to quantify.
And also market volatility, which there's a potential factor there. And again, you cite market volatility. Even though it's unlikely now to get Fed rate increases, there's still potential for volatility to have an impact on developing Asia.
Yes, so it's true that we now assess the risk of a rapid increase in Fed rates as being less likely than we thought last year. What has changed also, though, is that there's much more uncertainty about U.S. monetary policy, and that's actually measurable. You can measure the amount of the public perceptions about U.S. monetary policy uncertainty. And what we find is that during periods of greater uncertainty about U.S. monetary policy, those periods are associated with greater exchange rate volatility in developing Asia.
Abdul Abiad, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.